Good afternoon. My name is David Bixler. I am a saxophonist and educator, and I am the director of jazz activities here at Bowling Green State University. I grew up near Milwaukee, and as I got into jazz as a teenager, I used to hang out at jazz clubs in Milwaukee where they would serve a 16-year-old a beer, and I could bathe in the culture where this music I had fallen in love with came from. At the Jazz Estate, the Jazz Gallery, and my favorite, Yancey's Space Lounge, I got my feet wet going to jam sessions and listening to the national acts that would often come to Milwaukee from Chicago on off nights. However, it was not lost on 16-year-old me that the neighborhoods that housed the jazz clubs that I was going to was different than the neighborhood that I grew up in. After high school, I attended Indiana University, the perfect college town. At Indiana University, the head of the jazz department was a pioneer in jazz education, David Baker. And David Baker stood out at IU amongst the stellar faculty there. He was rocking a Mod Squad size afro and his hip jazz speak. But the thing, David, he created an environment where we, the students, that we were taught that we needed to know that this music was valuable and why it was valuable, because he said, if we continued as artists and as educators, we were going to have to be able to defend this music in what is often a hostile environment. And as I look back, I don't think that David was solely advocating for jazz music, but I think he was fighting for Black culture in a situation that was not welcoming to it. After graduation, I moved to New York City, and shortly after that, I got a gig playing lead alto with the vibraphonist Lionel Hampton in his big band, right? A Black artist who incidentally was part of Benny Goodman's racially integrated band of the late 30s. And I want to pause to let that sink in, because jazz music created in Black culture. It took a white star, Benny Goodman, to bring jazz music to Black musicians to an audience, all right? I was super stoked about this gig with Lionel Hampton, but I was no way prepared for it. The first gig we did, we flew to Detroit from New York, and I don't remember where we played in Michigan, but when the gig started, it was like a war zone, all right? Nothing prepared me for what was going on there. One of my points of pride, as a musician, was I could sight read anything. I mean, you talk about, flies on the wall, I could read it, right? It didn't matter here, all right? Music was torn, music was ripped, stuff was missing, there was instruction written all over the page. Things that probably meant something to the people that had put them there, but for me, it was worthless. Plus, at the same time, everyone around me is saying, hey, when we come up here, trombones are gonna play this, don't play what's on the page, but just listen and, you'll figure it out, just do it, all right? This went on for 3 hours, all right? So, the next morning, we have to meet the bus in front of the hotel to go to the next gig. I get out there early because I'm freaking out because of the experience from the previous night. It's just me and one of the trumpet players. Kind of silent for a minute, and then he looks at me and says, "You haven't played much lead alto, have you?" And the 24-year-old me got defensive, starting to construct the retort about all my experience and my ability, and all of a sudden I realized, no, in real jazz outside the school, I have not done this, all right? Additionally, as one of the few white cats on the band, it was interesting, I observed how white society reacted to seeing a group of Black people entering into a public space. Lionel would sometimes take the entire band out for dinner at nice restaurants, and the reception was not always welcoming, all right? Also, like later that year, it was my first trip to Europe, but we traveled as a band to Europe, and you have to go through customs in every country, and I'm wondering, man, why am I waiting for him? And after about a week, I finally realized if I don't open my mouth in Western Europe, they think I'm a homeboy. I guess they look at my passport. But the guy with the do-rag, my bandmate, it gets pulled out of line, it gets questioned every time, right? At this time, we're living in New York City. My wife and I, we raised 4 children in Harlem, all right? I've been accused of the G word, gentrification. I can honestly say that my motive for moving to Harlem was not economic exploitation, but was instead to find space and affordable housing for 2 musicians raising 4 children. And I think gentrification is probably a topic of its own talk, right? But nonetheless, in New York City and probably the rest of the U.S., these neighborhoods get dumped on. Public education options are minimum. They're stacked in favor with communities with means. There's friction between the community and police. Remember one time there was an addict on someone's stoop, and one of my non-white neighbors found me out and said, "Can you go tell the police about this?" And it was because he knew that the cops were going to react to me saying something rather than him. All right, so we saw stuff like that all the time. All this to say, I thought, as I'm pursuing this music, just trying to learn, doing gigs, studying, practicing, going to sessions, etc. I thought I had shown up to the game woke as far as my views on jazz, race, and American culture. I've dedicated a large portion of my life to the pursuit of this American art form. But in light of the horrific racial events of 2020, I had to do kind of a reboot on everything. All right. The history of jazz music is inextricably linked to the story of this nation. And I was forced to take a look deeper into the music that I played and taught and honor the fact that this beautiful music was created. Bear with me a second. The evil that was slavery. Essayist Gerald Early said, "There are only 3 things that America will be remembered for 2,000 years from now when they study." Forgive me, thank you. The civilization, the Constitution, jazz music, and baseball. These are the 3 most beautiful things this culture has ever created. And I think there is a great deal of truth in this statement. For the past 4 years, I've been producing a podcast once a month called Liner Note. It started as a project dedicated to the music I love and the people that create it. But once pandemic hit, the tenor of the interviews started to change. Back in the summer, I interviewed a friend, great saxophonist Antonio Hart. I've known Antonio for a long time. We've been talking about music for a while, and I thought, I got to go there. I just got to go there. So I asked him, as a black man, Antonio, what do you think about what's happening in America post George Floyd? And it was silent. It was just silent. I just wanted to warn everyone, I'm going to lose it. He was silent, and I left that in the podcast because it was so powerful. When he finally spoke, he was angry. It was painful to listen to. You can hear it in his voice as he talks about cops taking Dylan Roof to Burger King after he was picked up for the murders at the Bible study in the church in North Carolina. At one point, he addresses me and he says, I quote, "You're part of the community. You're one of my brothers, man. And you understand it, but though on some levels, there's certain things you'll never understand because you're not black. And I can tell you these things. I can tell you from my experience, and you can empathize with it. So when you ask that kind of question, I'm angry as hell, end quote. And that hit me in a way that is manifesting itself right now as I try to keep my composure speaking before you. But with that interview in the summer of 2020, I started to understand that the need for these conversations with friends, with people I have a history with, where race was never talked about. I was a guest artist at Northern Illinois University's Jazz Festival earlier this year. Reggie Thomas is a friend of mine that runs the jazz program. I've known Reggie for over 2 decades. Great friend, great pianist. And when I got there, he asked me if I wanted to talk about my podcast in front of his graduate history class. And he goes on to tell me how much he appreciates the conversations that we've been having. And he also says that it's not your typical jazz history class because I've decided to tell the story of the civil rights struggle as it parallels jazz. And so the conversation went, me and bro don't really feel comfortable. And he was like, well, I think they really need to hear you speak as a white musician. and what you're talking about on your podcast. It was super uncomfortable. Looking back, it was 50 minutes, and it's hard to explain. It was a class, there was black, white, and Latino students in their 20s, and, they are studying and trying to acquire the skills that I have, right? So when Antonio says, I'm one of his brothers, yeah, I know this music, and I love this music, and will continue to until I die. But now more than ever, the reality of how and why it was created is the elephant in the room. All right, when you start playing in your youth, no one says, "Hey, man, you shouldn't do this. You don't understand why this was created." And you fall in love with Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, you become obsessed with it, and it's all you want to do. And then at some point in life, it's all you can do. All right. So this gets me to my point. Is like, what do I do with this now? What do we do with this now? As a professor of jazz, what am I doing? What am I teaching the students, some of whom I see out there, about this music? These are the right notes. These are the tunes. This is the rep. Have fun. Historically, academia has taken the aspects of the music that can be addressed and evaluated in the same manner as the canon of white Eurocentric music. Harmony, melody, that stem from the same sources. You can put it into a syllabus and teach it. But what about the intangible? What about the blues? What about the groove? What about the attitude of the music? And how about the oppression, hate, and evil that fertilize the music? How does that get honored, if that is the correct term, as you teach this music, as you try to convey what this is about? It becomes difficult to codify many of the elements that are essential to jazz, but the elements that make jazz what it is. And I believe it is arrogance and fear that keeps Black American music from ascending to its rightful place in the conservatory. Last year on the podcast, I interviewed Robert Hurst, former bassist with both Wynton and Branford Marsalis, now on faculty at the University of Michigan. I met Bob when we were both freshmen at Indiana. And in the interview, he was talking about growing up Black and white society and said, quote, "It took me a long time to really feel comfortable saying, Black people, we the shit. We are the cultural hub of America when it comes to anything regarding music. And not just America, the world, Like you talk about music in the 20th century, we are the most influential, period," end quote. All right. Among the many things that baffle me about music school is why Thelonious Monk, Charles Mingus, and Billy Strayhorn aren't taught in the core curriculum. And Duke Ellington, in my opinion, the most important American composer, period. I love a lot of music, not just jazz, and I'm not here to lead the parade to cancel Mahler, all right? But it's time to give this music, the music often called jazz, its due. It's time to give the culture that produced this music its due. It's time for this country and the educational system to acknowledge the sin of slavery, the sin of racism that enabled this music. When Lou Marini was here earlier this semester, he said that he thought that perhaps we were too far gone as a nation to get over the racial divide. I don't believe that. In the last presidential election, the majority of American people chose hope, and I want to believe that we can do this. And lastly, in the summer of 2020, a former student of mine here at BG, who is Black, called out his white mentors on social media for remaining silent following the murder of George Floyd and all that followed. And although racial injustice actively had affected the way I see the world, at the time, I did not speak up about George Floyd and myriad others or Black Lives Matter movement. I regretfully stayed silent because I was embarrassed to speak. I felt weak because it's my culture that had done this and continues to perpetuate it. I thought, I am a white man. It's not my place to speak about these issues, and besides, I do not have anything unique or valid to say. It would be better to stay silent, I told myself, and let Black voices be heard. My daughter, senior at City College, who had been participating in the protests at City Hall, she encouraged me to see that what I had tried to pass off as humility was actually cowardice. Her mantra that summer was white silence is violence. And in speaking publicly here, I'm coming out of my head and committing to change. I understand that there will be those that don't care what I have to say about jazz and race, and I can live with that and even understand that. But in the same way that I feel compelled to play this music filtered through my experience and my humanity, in the same way, I also feel emboldened to speak about race as a white male saxophonist and educator. Desmond Tutu said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Thank you.